2 Timothy chapter 2. We're ready to begin at verse 14. Keep reminding God's people of these things. Well, wait, let's stop there. What things? Oh gosh, a ton of things. If you just go back to what we have as chapter 2 and look at the beginning of that, first of all, he offers the principle that you entrust to reliable men who will then teach others, and they'll be qualified to teach others. So you have this flywheel of replication and leadership. And then he talks about suffering. He talks about suffering as a good soldier. And he has the three or word pictures of the soldier, the athlete, and the farmer. And what's the point of that? Has to do with don't pretend you're not in a war. Secondly, train. And third, do the things that will promote growth. That's my gross illustration. And then he goes on to talk about what we've been talking about, the trustworthy sayings. Keep reminding God's people of these things. So here's something I think is important for whether you're the pastor or whether you're a member of the church or whether you're just an attendee. We often need to be reminded. We sometimes need new information, but more often we need to be reminded about things that we already know. Now think about this. When Paul wrote to Timothy, there was no written New Testament, what we have as the New Testament. It was all in fragments, a letter or another letter or one of the Gospels or all four of the Gospels, but it hadn't yet been codified, meaning it hadn't been yet put into one volume. And so that it was in fact being written as Timothy was being the lead guy in the church at Ephesus. And so we learn by repetition. And I think what Paul was saying is, hey, Timothy, don't get tired of reminding the people of these truths. And I would even say, whenever I have the chance, to young guys in ministry, don't believe the idea that we already know that, let's move on. Do we really? And I'm not talking about your eschatology. I'm not talking about your end times teaching. I'm talking about how do we live today right here with the people in our world? How do we reflect the nature and the ways of Jesus in how we treat other people? How do we follow his design? How do we execute on what he declares as our mission? I don't know that you ever get done talking about those things. Now, I will say this. If you talk about, teach, and preach the same thing all the time, you never get off script. That's not what Paul's talking about. My dad used to tell this story. When he was in Bible college, the Bible college supplied the preachers for a good portion of certainly southern and western Oklahoma. And there was a town, there still is a little town, named Gotebo. Only Okies have probably heard of Gotebo. My dad was sent out to preach at Gotebo. And he realized there were some odd things about this church in terms of the building. It had 2 communion tables. And that's odd. In an independent Christian church, it's very odd to have more than 1 communion table in the center. It's the centerpiece for the auditorium, or in most people's parlance, sanctuary. Well, Dad noticed this but didn't understand what. And then he watched people begin to come in and they parted off as though there was one side for one group and the other side for the other group, because that's how it was. Well, Dad was, he preached, and he basically preached on God's love. And when he finished preaching, one of the families took him, and this was always a custom. If you're older, you remember this. Somebody would take the preacher and his family home for dinner. And at dinner, Dad said, help me understand what, well, this is my paraphrase, but he asked, what's up with that? And the guy at the table said, well, had a big disagreement. Half the church wanted it one way and half the church wanted it the other way, and we just decided we'd be like two churches in one building. This was very intriguing to my dad. So he said, what was the disagreement about? And the man of the house said, I don't know. Mama, can you remember what the problem was when the church split? Nope, she couldn't remember it either. It's kind of like the Hatfields and the McCoys. All they knew was, we's a feudin'. Had no idea why. Dad went back the next week, preached the same sermon. And one of the people on the way out said, what? Why did you preach the same sermon over again? And Dad said, well, you obviously haven't gotten it yet. Okay, who knows whether all the pieces of my dad's story are accurate, but I do know in principle that happens all the time. People need to be reminded that in my heart and my mind, the thing I would most want to remind people of, and I think at least one of the things that Paul was urging Timothy to keep reminding God's people of, is that to love God, that's our purpose. To love people, to love one another as Christ loved us, that's our strategy. Okay. Then Paul goes on, warn them before God against quarreling about words. It is of no value and only ruins those who listen. You know, we live in a very litigious world, and I'm not blaming social media for this, but because we have social media so readily available, and so much of social media, and maybe this is not all bad, but social media is a platform to disagree. Now, there's a big difference between disagreeing and quarreling. The people in that church in Godibo, they didn't just disagree with each other. They were quarreling. Quarreling, it's fighting. A reasonable discussion about 2 points of view, even a heated discussion, if it's reasonable about 2 points of view, that's not quarreling. We sometimes in conservative churches, we talk way, way more about what we're against than what we're for. I don't think that we don't have a reason to talk about what we're against. There are things, hey, God's against some stuff, and he didn't stutter about it. All right, I'm against that too. But God, he revealed what he is for and about, and maybe we ought to do a lot more with that. But did you get this part? Warn them before God. It's not like me going, hey. No, it's about folks in God's presence. I warn you against quarreling about words. All right, quarreling about words. What are we doing here? Well, words carry ideas. They do. And there are times when the properly selected and carefully spoken right words are incredibly important. There are other times where we make the importance of words more than what they actually may be. I run into this in couples counseling all the time. It's not the words that are exchanged. I'm hearing them and I hear hurt, I hear disappointment, I hear frustration. The other one hears an attack. And we can argue about words. There's this other kind of quarreling about words, and it has to do with whose word makes the most difference. Whose word would tip the scales? See, what Paul said is true. It is of no value and only ruins those who listen. Because if my focus is on the quarrel and the disagreement, and they're wrong and I'm right, that I can't focus there and focus on love God with all your heart, soul, mind, and strength, and love your neighbor as yourself. It's not possible. That kind of quarreling, not only will it not move the church and God's kingdom forward, not only can we not participate with God's grand design, it's of no value. It ruins people. So if you have anything to do with the preaching and teaching on any level at your church, make certain that you're not wading into quarrels about words. Verse 15. This is a great verse. Like all the others aren't, but do your best to present yourself to God as one approved, a worker who does not need to be ashamed and who correctly handles the word of truth. Now that was a personal word to Timothy, but it applies to every follower of Jesus. This is a statement of commission. Do your best to present yourself to God as one approved. Let's start with do your best. Some days my best is not very good. There are many days when I echo the famous words of Tiger Woods upon losing a tournament. I didn't have my A game today. Well, you know what? There's a lot of days I don't have my A game. But the point is, I'm going to do my best. Really? There are days when I wish I could say every day I bring my best, but I can't say that. Well, I could say it, but it wouldn't be true. What actually happens on those days is I bring good enough to get by. And that's not a good way to do it. I think you probably already know. But I'm going to reemphasize. You know what? In this life with Christ, don't just bring enough to get by. Do your best. Now, I got to come back to that because that has been misrepresented and misinterpreted by people through the ages. I got another idea, but I'm out of time. So I'll see you next time on So Care with Stevie Boy.